And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great to have on today Zachary Elliott from the Paradox Institute to talk about, well, something pretty basic, but wow, is it controversial, the sex binary. The fact that we're made as male and female. Longtime listeners know that this is not a new topic for the podcast, but recently met Zach. He's become a subject expert on this. Probably not something you thought would happen, Zach, as you're getting into things.
Yeah, definitely
but
not.
welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great opportunity.
Yeah, so the big idea for this episode is, every parent, every pastor, every youth pastor, those working as Christian citizens in the public space, this question comes up time and time again, the definition of male and female. And we've been talking, Zach, you were here in the state of Indiana to testify on a bill recently. And you had a couple of conversations like, who knew we would spend so much time trying to just simply define human beings as male and female. But we certainly want to start with Scripture. We come back to the created order in Genesis 1. Male and female created he, them. Biology is not bigotry. And wanted to dive in further. So I imagine most listeners get the basic concept. We're made male and female. Maybe you've had people kind of kick back at you with that intersex question. What about someone with ambiguous genitalia or these developmental sex disorders? And so we want to actually go deeper. This episode, I want to arm you, listener, with some of the information I've been really grateful to receive. Zach's videos and research has stood up to legal and medical scrutiny, and I wanted to have him on to walk through that. I wanted to talk about the apologetics value of that and arm you to go deeper than just the basic kind of first line there. So Zach Elliott is a science educator who has studied the biology of sex since 2017. Through his research of the scientific literature, he has authored 4 books on sex differences, combining rigorous research with accessible explanations for a general audience. His work has been informed through collaboration and consultation with medical doctors, biologists, and other experts in the field. Zach, if you would, just jump in, maybe share a recent success story or just maybe a meaningful moment in your work.
So the past couple months, we published 2 new books. One was the Sex Development Handbook, which we'll get into, which is a visual guide on disorders of sex development, understanding those rare disorders. That reached #1 in developmental biology and embryology on Amazon. And then we also have a children's book that is published by my wife and partner here at the Paradox Institute. She illustrated it, wrote it. It's about male and female and understanding what male and female are for children in a very age-appropriate way. And beautifully illustrated, that reached #1 in children's biology books as well. So great success on that front. And then also working with Josh here in Indiana with helping testify for bills like defining sex, making sure that records are accurately defined when it comes to sex and birth certificates, when it comes to sex segregated spaces. So all of that has been a really good success as well. So
It's been neat to see, we're maybe kind of a niche ministry organization, and then because of developments in culture, it's like everyone's coming to you all of a sudden, and maybe that kind of flywheel principle. You've been doing it for a long time, and now it's been great to see the attention that you've received. It's just important work. Well, let's go ahead and dive in a bit on share the background about Paradox Institute. What led you to focus on educating the public about the biology of sex and sex differences? I imagine a lot of listeners, kind of get the cultural moment, but maybe a little more personal. What led you into this?
So it really, I started Paradox Institute in 2020, and I saw that there was a huge need in the culture for visually powerful, accessible scientific information on male and female. Because one, you can go through and read the scientific literature, which I did, but I also felt like there was a real need for the general public to have something that was bite-sized, accessible, that it could relate the scientific literature to just the general audience. And so my background actually started in architecture. I was in college in 2016, and I've always been very interested in design and visual communication and also creating spaces for people to just use. And so went into architecture for school. And then at that time, this huge cultural shift started happening where people were denying male and female. People were denying biology, just denying sex differences. And I was very fascinated with why that was the case and also what the actual scientific literature said. And so I started actually doing reading on my own. I just I just read and read and read, using my university library, all the scientific literature, the major papers and textbooks on human biology, on male and female, and that made me so interested in diving in deeper. So I wrote a short little book in 2017 on that, and then in 2020 I felt called to really continue that and expand it, and wrote a longer book. And then in the beginning of 2020 I started the Paradox Institute, and so that was kind of the initial steps in college. But even before that, I grew up in a Christian household where we were very science focused, very focused on understanding the world, and that it's good to understand the world around you, and even that it's healthy to even question why you believe what you believe, and really look into things. And that's something that the Bible also teaches, is to actually look into why you believe what you believe and understand it. And so that whole, I think, growing up that way really made me interested in diving deep into subjects that I really found important and valuable, and I felt like this male and female topic was so powerful to me, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly why it called me, but it was just a calling that I felt was so strong, and I put those skills that I had with design and visual communication into Paradox Institute. So it's kind of a confluence of different skills. Yeah.
So I love this for many reasons. First, I was sharing with a group of students this week why I was reading the preamble of the 1851 Indiana Constitution, and I got a lot of kind of blank stares, like, what kind of nerd are you? And there's this great line in there about, in Indiana, we thanked Almighty God for the ability to choose our own form of government, which I think is fascinating. But the fact that you were, out of interest reading these, scientific journals, I'm glad to have kind of a kindred spirit. Like, surely reading the 1851 Constitution isn't that weird, right? If you're like, hey, I want to read this scientific literature. But part of the goals, or one of the goals of the podcast, the Good Citizen podcast, is to help really every Christian impact their own zip code. And that's discerning kind of where God's placed us, what are our abilities, our passions, and I believe the complexity of the world's need is met by the diversity of Christian calling. So I love hearing your story, and who knew that's where God was leading you, but He's led you into this really important topic. Well, let's go ahead and dive in and maybe just start at the basics. So as a Christian, where do we find the sex binary? Why is it important? And then maybe just kind of jumping in, both feet into the deep end here, how does this, do we have like a working definition of sex? And maybe listeners like, yeah, male and female, but it's a little more complex than that. So our biblical basis for it, and then do we have a working definition?
So the biblical basis would be found in Genesis at the beginning, where God creates male and female, and that is a foundation of many species, most species that exist, including humans, and they are separated into two different forms. You have individuals who are male and individuals who are female. And so when it comes to an actual definition, when I started to look into the scientific literature, we often think that, male and female, like male is XY, female is XX, but it actually goes far deeper than just that. And so when it comes down to it, male and female are about reproduction. And so when it specifically about males are bodies that are organized around producing sperm. Females have bodies that are organized around producing eggs. So it's really that fundamental difference in the so-called gamete type. So whether you have a body organized around sperm or organized around eggs, that's really the fundamental distinction between male and female, because that's the fundamental role. The males provide the sperm, the females provide the eggs. And so even people who can't currently produce mature gametes, such as children, or like postmenopausal women, for example, they still have bodies that are organized around one of those two roles. And so that's kind of how you understand what sex is at its foundation, is about that organization. And that applies to plants. It applies to other animals as well.
So this is really helpful. And what I wanted to get over to the listeners today is, this is the type of definition for states, the federal government, others that are working to clarify these things in our law. And I've always thought the law is kind of the ultimate apologetics argument, because in a normal person-to-person discussion or even a debate, you're trying to persuade someone else to order their life according to the truth. And a law is saying we want to order society according to the truth. And this particular idea of when you're saying, hey, this person's male, this person's female, it's their body is organized around reproduction. That's helpful. Now, anyone that's had this discussion knows what's probably going to come next, right? What's going to be the objection to that argument with intersex conditions. So would you talk about some common myths about intersex conditions that you've addressed in your writings?
So one would be that a common myth you'll see is that there are six common biological sexes in humans. Now, we know there's only two, so what do they mean by six sexes? And when you look into it, they're talking about very rare chromosomal disorders, such as X, where you don't have two X's. You might have XXY. You might have XYY. So they list out those and say those are six sexes. And so in reality, those are sex chromosome disorders within males or females. So when you actually look at each of those examples and their development path, they develop down an unambiguous male or female pathway. And so, for example, you might take someone with XXY chromosomes. They have male-making genes on their Y chromosome that leads them to develop testes, penis, etc., and they develop as a male. And so they're not a different sex. It's just unusual sex chromosomes within a male or within a female. So the activists are conflating sex chromosomes with sex. So that's a common myth. A second one would be that some humans are both male and female at the same time. Now, that formally in biology, that is called hermaphroditism. You probably have heard people claim that, oh, there's human hermaphrodites. Now, hermaphroditism is a specific system in other animals where they actually do develop both roles in the same individual, and that means that they can produce both sperm and eggs. So their body is organized around both. But in humans, that never happens, and we can get into why that's the case later on, but they will often bring up examples they might bring up an example of a human who has quote-unquote ambiguous genitalia. So their external genitalia, it's unclear when they're born whether they are a male or female on the basis of their external genitals. An example of that would be a condition called 5-ARD. So it's basically where a male who has testes, they can't produce DHT, and so he is unable to fully develop his external genitals. So they can appear ambiguous or appear female-like, but he has testes. The testes produce tons of testosterone. He can respond to testosterone just fine. And so he's just missing that final step of male sex development. But that doesn't mean that he's both sexes. It doesn't mean that he's ambiguous. It's just that his external genitals failed to develop fully, even though he actually is a male. And so that's an example of how to debunk something like that. You just look at the individual case and you see what's actually going on with their biology, and it really demystifies what's actually happening. You realize, oh, okay, it's a disorder within a male, and it doesn't mean that he's both sexes. He's just a male who, is unable to fully develop his external genitals. So, yeah.
And so I'm just thinking in the context of maybe a back and forth conversation, and so maybe those common myths come up. How could individuals respond with, broadly speaking, about DSDs, and maybe you could define that term, help us better understand that term. That broadly speaking, how could doctors determine, this body is organized around female reproduction, this body is organized around male reproduction? Can that happen for every human being, despite DSDs, despite maybe anomalies?
Yes. So when you look into it, when you look into every single condition, you can discover that they do have a definable sex. And that occurs through a multidisciplinary analysis when they're either being diagnosed as an infant or being diagnosed later in life. And so they can look at their gonads, their internal genitalia, their external genitalia, their hormone profile, their chromosomes. They take all that together to understand what developmental path they actually went down. And they can very clearly define their sex. When it comes to defining what DSDs are, so you'll often hear that they're called intersex conditions. Disorders of sex development is the scientific term, and DSD basically means any congenital condition, so a condition that you're born with, where you have atypical sex chromosomes, atypical gonadal structures, atypical internal genitalia, or atypical external genitalia. So basically any component of your reproductive system that developed with a congenital anomaly. So you can think of it as like, people are born with congenital anomalies in their limbs, in their fingers, or they're born with extra fingers or with too few fingers, for example. So a similar type of concept is happening in the reproductive system of these people with DSDs. They're born with a congenital anomaly. They're males or females. They just have some type of anomaly in their reproductive system.
That's helpful. And so if you hear that terminology DSD, that's what it is. And so I guess one of the challenges in this space is when someone claims to be transgender, of course, it's a cultural issue. So they're going to claim, I perceive myself to be a gender that is opposite of my biological sex or my sex, male and female. Does this, when these things develop, can doctors generally determine when someone is born that they are primarily female, organized around female reproduction or male reproduction? Or does sometimes that happen a little bit later, where maybe they go through puberty and then they're able to make that analysis? Maybe help us understand how that's done in the medical field.
So usually in the first world, we go through oftentimes one genetic screening. When we're in the womb, doctors will do basic genetic testing for various diseases. They'll also do ultrasound where they can visually look around the 20th week or so to see the external genitalia. And that's when they say, oh, you're having a boy, you're having a girl, for the most part, right? And so looking at external genitalia is around 99.98 to 99.99% accurate for determining sex alone. So in most cases, it's completely accurate. You'll almost never experience a situation where it's not accurate. But to answer your question, for example, later in life, there are a few people where they might be born with genitalia that looks very, let's say, female typical, like the example I gave earlier with 5-ARD. So that's a good example where they're often not diagnosed until later in puberty. Now, this condition usually only happens in the third world, but they are usually diagnosed later in puberty when their body starts to masculinize more, their external genitalia actually starts to grow, and the penis starts to grow, the testes start to descend, and then you realize, okay, I have a disorder, and you go get it diagnosed, and they find out that they're actually male, for example.
And so I've analogized, and Zach, you've done a great job of this as well, kind of analogizing this to the life debate, where so often what happens is, well, what about the rape exception? And so the conversation we're saying, hey, all babies that are, they're conceived, they're made in the image of God, worthy of the protection of our laws, and well, what about rape? And so oftentimes the conversation gets turned to the exception rather than the rule. Mm-hmm. And I think in this case, like what you said, it's 99.98%, babies. Yeah. And so again, we're talking about
context. To give you even context, that's important too. With DSDs, most of those DSD conditions, they result in unambiguous males or females. So even within that minority that the activists love to bring up, most of those within that group, they are born unambiguously male or female, where it's accurate to determine their sex just by their external genitals. It's just that they have some other part of their condition affecting their maybe internal structures, their hormone production, their function of their gonads, and things like that. But yeah, most of the time you can very easily tell even within that group, and it's only a very, very small minority within that tiny minority that are actually sometimes difficult to ascertain sex just by external genitalia alone, where you have to do further investigation and diagnosis to see what sex they are.
No, I appreciate that. And this is, again, an area where I think a lot of us, we haven't read the scientific literature like Zach has. And I found this really helpful just to, if somebody goes to that exception, you can just quickly say, 99.98%, and then you can have a multidisciplinary team that can determine harder cases. But every human individual is either organized around female reproduction or male reproduction. Mm-hmm. So I just found that super helpful on a question that I had not, dug into some of the basics about. Well, let's get to some of your books. So you have books. You also have incredible videos. I really want to encourage our listeners to go over to YouTube to look up the Paradox Institute and to dive into some of those. But maybe explain just some of the main thesis of binary. We've been talking some about that topic already, but perhaps anything we haven't covered, binary debunking the sex spectrum myth.
So the main thesis is that basically I walk through 10 major sex spectrum arguments that the culture often uses that are found in pop science magazines, that are found on X, that are found even used by lawyers or even doctors sometimes. So I take 10 of those main arguments and debunk them and just walk through why each of their claims are wrong and what the science actually says. And so it's a very accessible guide to combating the sex spectrum argument, where it also gives you summaries at the end of each chapter so you can understand just the bullet points as well. And it also has an overview chapter at the beginning that walks you through basically the principles of the sex spectrum, the main pattern of arguments that you always will see and that are found in all their arguments. And it walks you through the science of why each of those principles are baseless and how they misrepresent science for their own agenda. So it's really like a Rosetta Stone or like guide to really understanding the sex spectrum and then debunking it and having that ammunition basically.
And would one of those be, say, like the gender unicorn, if folks are familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
And especially for those maybe called into public education, public spaces, I think this is just an excellent resource. So thank you for taking the time to put that together.
Yeah, and the great thing that we always do, like in the binary book as well, is that I always make sure that every claim has a scientific citation. So when you're reading through the book, for example, there will be a little number that's basically indicating, this has a citation to it, and you go look up the number down the chapter, and then you find the actual scientific source. So every claim has an in-text citation, and you can go and look up those papers further.
And so I mentioned the videos briefly, but maybe talk a little bit more about that. How does your work, including those videos and the research, how have you kind of landed on those strategies to clarify misconceptions?
Yeah, so our main like flagship content are those animated videos where we are doing about 5-minute long animated videos, and we're basically communicating scientific topics and debunking these myths that gender activists often use in a very accessible, visually powerful way. So it makes it very engaging, it makes it bite-sized, very digestible, and it's very focused on really a general audience, and also 18 to 24, even teenagers. It's great for middle school and up, and so it has a very wide applicability. So that was really the goal, is making it as widely accessible as possible, and then also making sure that you can go into the description, you can check out the transcript for the video, you can check out all the scientific sources that are used in the video, and all of that that really makes it very powerful. And so I found that most activists have a hard time fighting against these videos because they directly cite all this scientific literature, and they don't have a response other than, well, you don't have a biology degree. And it's like, you don't need a biology degree to communicate, or a degree in general to communicate truths and to learn about the world, right? And I've talked about before, all this work is also backed up and reviewed by medical doctors and biologists. So that type of strategy has worked very well in terms of just producing very digestible, accessible content. And we can get into some examples, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. And we appreciate that you take those materials and just put them into, you kind of put them on the shelf where we can grab them and use them for families. Certainly if there's youth pastor listening, even a parent listening, and these sorts of things have come up, kid comes home from school, even at a Christian school, certainly access to YouTube, TikTok, these types of ideas are being thrown around. So we've talked about the developmental sex, or DSDs, developmental sex disorders, and you took the time most recently to create the Sex Development Handbook. Maybe explain a little bit about that and how that can help folks.
Yeah, so the Sex Development Handbook, the idea behind it was there is no book that exists that is very accessible for a general audience that discusses this topic of DSDs and human sex development, that also includes visual diagrams. So combining that together, I was very interested in making something that was able to have visual diagrams that were very accessible, that was medically accurate, and just for a wide audience. So for example, this is what it looks like on the interior. So you can see each spread has a DSD condition that it covers, and then it walks you through the development path, going from the chromosomes, the gonads, the genitalia, And then on the other side of the spread, it has accessible commentary that just walks you through the biology, what causes the disorder, how the disorder is treated in medical practice. So it has very up-to-date, recent clinical practice research in every single spread as well. So it walks you through about 25 DSDs that are often used in arguments. And then it also goes through about 40 DSDs total at the end with like a full glossary as well. So very good resource. And it also covers typical male and female sex development as well to give you a base foundation first.
No, so excellent resource. And as you could probably tell, those that are just listening in can't see him showing the book, but everything's done tactfully, even as he's described things today in age-appropriate ways, but also medically accurate. And so, again, just a great resource, like you said, nothing else out there. And as this is a major issue in culture, I think it's important that we arm ourselves with that information. So I wanted to pivot from that into how this research has influenced your perspective on current debates around gender identity and transgender issues. Why is the sex binary such an important issue and a powerful answer to what's going on in culture?
So the trans activists, gender activists, they are always focused on deconstructing, subverting, dismantling the sex binary because it goes against their fundamental delusions that one, that they can change their sex, that two, that sex doesn't matter. The binary has so many, it sounds so simple, which it is in many ways, but there's also so many like deep, profound truths in the sex binary. That the fact that humans cannot change sex, the fact that our bodies are organized around certain two different roles in reproduction, and that there's many different effects of that when it comes to your sex hormones that you have, when it comes to your genetics, when it comes to your response to disease, all of these things put together, it really goes against their beliefs at a fundamental level. And so they are just dead set on subverting that. And when I was researching this topic for my second book, The Gender Paradox, before I started the Paradox Institute, I was really interested too in like, what does the science say about gender identity? Because they use gender identity all the time to claim that, oh, I have this gender identity, or that should be superseding sex, that it's more important than sex. And so I discovered that they believe that there is a subjective sense of self, that they are either a man or a woman on a subjective level, but then they also claim at the same time that it's not subjective, that it's completely objective, and that it's based in biology. And so I was interested in, okay, well, what are the biological foundations for that? And I found that there are no biological foundations for that because it is a completely subjective thing, right? So scientists will often try to say, oh, there is a biological basis for gender identity. So I went and I researched the scientific literature trying to find the actual basis for that. The most I could find was just the fact that we as humans, as we're growing, as children, we start to understand who we are. We start to understand that we are male or female and what that means as we grow older. And so that's just a natural point of development when it comes to just child developmental psychology. And it's similar to other things where we just understand who we are in other aspects as well as we grow older and like what the reality is. So that's really the only, I guess, basis, but it's not gender identity. It's something else. That's just normal development, right? Normal, just understanding yourself. They mean something much different, I discovered, when it comes to gender identity. Something that supersedes sex, something that is almost metaphysical in a way, where they claim that, you're born in the wrong body, that you have almost like this gendered soul, and that they know the real soul, and that they're trying to like match their body with their soul. It's just like, it's very metaphysical. And that's why you'll never actually find scientific evidence for gender identity.
And that's where it's pseudo-spiritual. I mean, you've used like metaphysical, like it's almost spiritual in a sense, religious. Mm-hmm. And a number of folks have mentioned kind of even when you have a more traditional religion, you're going to have particular holy days or high holy days. You're going to have certain rituals. You're going to have certain beliefs that push you outside of orthodoxy. And so, like you've mentioned, I think understanding what's happened more along those lines rather than, okay, here are these 3 scientific studies that determined this. Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned the videos, and I wanted to jump into just a few of those. And certainly one of the ways this topic iterates is in sports. And of course, listeners are probably familiar with the girls' sports issue, Title IX. There was a reason why Congress passed Title IX, separate protections for females in sports. Certainly we are equal in dignity, but different in some of the basics that we've talked about today. Could you maybe mention that video and a few key principles from that one, but then maybe a couple others, just so folks have a taste of what you have on the website and on YouTube?
We have the most recent video is called Sex Screening in Sports, How It Works. And it goes through basically the process that is now used in many sports organizations recently, including World Athletics, as to how we screen for sex and how we filter out those who have the make male gene, the SRY gene, versus those who do not. And then what happens when there are atypical rare cases, like we discussed with disorders of sex development, and how those are evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And so that video was done in consultation with biologists and sports scientists, and we can get into some detail of how that actually works, but yeah, that video was very helpful, and it's cool that it's actually, that process is used in many organizations now.
And I was just watching some of it, and of course this came before the United States Supreme Court recently, and even if you have a male and female that are essentially the same height, the same weight, like the muscle density, bone density, lung capacity, like you just went into all of these really helpful distinctions
Gotcha.
that show,
Yeah.
the difference between male and female. And again, equal in dignity, but God has designed us this way, and it's not bigotry to recognize those things. So it was just a really helpful snapshot, I thought, on that particular issue.
That was our older video on, which is still accurate today, which is on basically the male advantage in sports and what happens when you reduce testosterone in males, and looking at why that doesn't actually eliminate advantage. And because it's a common argument, they're like, oh, well, we'll just reduce our testosterone, right? But it doesn't work, because females and males, they're not just different on their testosterone levels. They're different on the course of their development across time in terms of musculoskeletal advantages, in terms of heart and lung capacity, all these things that are not eliminated when testosterone is suppressed. And I did that in consultation with a developmental biologist and a sports physiologist on basically their literature review, where they go into and look at all these studies of testosterone suppression, and they see that it doesn't really reduce the advantage much at all. And so that one was very fascinating, because like you said, when you're comparing even like to like athletes, so let's say like a female athlete and a male athlete who are at the same level in weightlifting, for example, and they're in the same weight class and they're the same height, the male will lift 30% heavier than the female, just because of his musculoskeletal advantages due to male development, which is crazy. So yeah, it really blows out of the water those claims that males are just people with higher testosterone than females, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, and in fact, if you listeners followed the Supreme Court oral arguments on this issue, that was one of the claims is, well, can we have kind of a class of males with lower testosterone, and can they be protected? And so again, your video, I think, had anticipated that argument coming in. So that was one topic, again, super helpful if listeners are interested. Maybe one or two others that you put out that maybe you direct listeners to.
Yeah, so another common one, one of the most recent ones was, can humans change sex? And so this is fascinating, because we did a comparative biology analysis of clownfish versus humans, because transactivists love bringing up clownfish as an example for why humans can change sex, because clownfish can actually change sex for real. And so we compare both of those systems. We compare clownfish biology and how they actually change sex, and then we compare humans and why humans cannot change sex. And so what we discovered was that with clownfish have a complete transformation of their reproductive system, where their gonad type actually switches from testes to ovaries. And the testes go from producing sperm to then having ovaries that produce eggs. And so their entire system transforms on a genetic level and an anatomical level. And so humans can't do that. We can't do that at all. We're not plastic to that degree like clownfish. We don't have the genetics the genetic capability to do that. And so when people say that humans change sex, what they're really claiming is that, oh, humans just were able to alter our secondary sex characteristics through hormones like breasts, facial hair, that type of thing, right? But that is only at a superficial level. It doesn't actually transform your reproductive system to the opposite sex type. So that's one example of a good video to watch as well.
Yeah, before you move on, I'm just reflecting back to the created order, Genesis 1:26 and 27, and there's a mysterious aspect of being made in God's image, and longtime listeners know we've dug into that a number of times. It's beautiful, mysterious, complex, but it does say, in the image of God made he them, male and female created he them, and then we're different in kind than the animal kingdom, and so trying to compare ourselves to clownfish, it points us back to the goodness of God's design, the uniqueness of humanity, and you see it down to just the level that you've talked about it here, and so it continues. I just continue to be amazed at our Creator God and the goodness of His creation and how it's supported by the science. So maybe one more that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. So a common one that you'll see transactivist claim is that we all begin female. And so this is another recent video where we took about 7 minutes to go through that myth that we all begin female in the womb. And I walk through why the myth is wrong, where it originated, and what the science actually says. And it's actually really fascinating because in the culture, it often became popularized in Jurassic Park, where in Jurassic Park, one of the scientists said, oh, all vertebrate embryos begin as female. And it just takes an extra hormone, testosterone, given at the right time to make them male. And so in the 90s, that was very popularized thanks to Jurassic Park. But it originated even before then.
That strong scientific
yes.
documentary,
yes,
Jurassic Park.
Totally real.
Yes, indeed.
So in reality, what's going on is that people confuse the undifferentiated stage before any sex differentiation begins, where embryos are basically, on the physical level, our reproductive system looks the same. And so you can't really tell, there's no penis, for example, for males even. And so they're like, oh, so everybody must be female because there's like no male development yet. But it gets it wrong because both male and female embryos, even though we're sexed at the beginning, at conception with our genetics, all of those embryos, we all begin physically undifferentiated. So that basically means that our reproductive tissue is in a neutral state. And it only happens around the 6th week where our different genetics trigger that neutral tissue down the male or female pathway. And so it's an either-or type of branching. We have that neutral tissue that is then triggered by genetics down one of those two pathways. And so it's not a matter of we all start female and then if you're just given testosterone, you develop as a male. It doesn't work that way at all. And so it's just a myth that originated back in actually the 1940s, which that video goes into and explains how the actual science works.
Yeah. Again, listeners can tell me fascinating stuff, arguments that maybe we haven't come up against, and when you're having conversations with folks, they'll drop these things as kind of a gotcha, and then if you are equipped, you can push back on it. So, and we'll link to the YouTube channel for Paradox Institute, so folks can go over there. So we've talked about this, Zach. I am interested certainly in the legal medical aspects of your work, and I'm grateful for it. As I mentioned before, it has withstood legal medical scrutiny. You've worked closely with biologists, geneticists, etc. But I'm also interested in the apologetics aspect of this, and I think most listeners have already picked up on it. We've been taking notes the whole time. But would you speak specifically to that? And I'm thinking of someone that's in ministry, maybe it's a youth pastor, but then also the value for parents. And so just some ideas. I know you have a bit of a little apologetics background maybe in high school, but would you maybe, thinking with that cap on, how can these materials be helpful for us?
So it's a great, anytime you have very accessible scientific information where you understand more detail about the natural world, it can always be helpful with biblical teaching as well. So our work is a great companion to biblical teaching because natural truths and theological truths enrich each other. So oftentimes people see the natural world and the biblical or theological world as in conflict, at least those who are maybe atheist or sometimes certain certain denominations, let's say, or they might have disagreements with the natural with scientific evidence, and that's okay. But when you can actually look at what is scientifically true and what is theologically true, those things really work together very well. And so pastors and parents can use our scientific resources to help solidify what the Bible teaches about male and female and the sacredness of our bodies and the important differences between male and female. So that can basically just enrich the theological teaching, and the theological teaching can enrich the natural teaching as well. So that's something that I love about Christianity, that we're encouraged to explore and understand the natural world, and that doing so actually enriches our understanding of God and the relationship to God with us. So,
I so appreciate that. I went through almost a semester with our student group in Genesis 1. I mean, you talk about AI, this issue, and having the scientific backup, it just puts a stamp of approval when you, especially if you have kids that are very analytical, they've been on TikTok and they've heard some of these arguments. If we don't come back with some scientific basis, it falls into the trap that the secular world's going to say, well, this is just a myth. Christianity is just a myth. But I also think just the truth that we are embodied individuals. Many others have said this too, but transgenderism seems a little bit like the new Gnosticism, kind of an ancient idea that only the spiritual matters, the physical doesn't. And Christianity is not that. We are embodied creatures. It goes all the way back to creation. And I think it can just help us. I certainly have been blessed by this, just understanding how we are beautifully and wonderfully made at almost an entirely new level. And so it's just been so beautiful, and your work does that. So just can't commend it enough. Well, let's turn.
Something unique with Christianity,
please.
It's something very unique with Christianity, where I studied other religions as well in high school, and part of our apologetics courses that I took. And it was very interesting that Christianity, as far as I saw, was really the only religion that really valued both the body and the soul in terms of that they're united things, and that it's good for us to honor the body, that the body matters even after death. The body is still something that matters. And so those things have really made us as a culture through Christianity really respect the body in ways that other cultures had not. And we see that when you do start to go away from Christianity, you start to lose respect and sacredness of the body in terms of how the culture treats it. So,
absolutely. And we're entering a world where the rise of artificial intelligence, artificial wombs. When you have, we had on Katie Faust to talk a little bit about developments with being able to just order 100 surrogate kids. Who's going to push back against these ideas, against just a profit motive, or we've got to beat our competitors around the world, unless we have, I think, that strong foundation of the image of God. So I appreciate you mentioning that as well. Well, moving quickly into kind of the government space, again, many listeners I'm sure are familiar with girls' sports. Also, just the concept of the Department of Corrections, that we would place individuals in prisons in these very vulnerable spaces in correlation to their sex rather than a perceived gender. This can lead to all sorts of complications. But I was going to ask if you would speak specifically to the importance of accurate birth records, certificates, but also medical records, and that those actually reflect sex rather than a perceived gender.
Yeah, so obviously it sometimes it's hard for people to articulate very simple truths because they're self-evident truths. So it seems very obvious. Like, of course you should have. Yes. Yeah, we have to say, explain why this is important. When you get down to the details, it's actually very fascinating why it's important. And so one example would be when it comes to accurate medical treatment in emergency situations where the doctors need to know what sex you are immediately, and they don't necessarily have time to do a full examination, and just make sure, right? And so you need accurate records with your documentation, like driver's license and things like that, where it can just immediately tell the doctor whether you're male or female. So one example of a real case was a trans man, so a woman who identifies as a man, and she had an inaccurate record on her driver's license that said male, when in reality she's female. So she shows up with abdominal pain, severe abdominal pain to the doctor at the ER and stuff, and they think that she's a male. So they treat her as though she's a male, and she dies because she did not get accurate medical treatment. Forgot what exactly it was. It may have been related to actual pregnancy, for example, that they didn't know about because they thought that she was a male. And so that's one real world example of the harms of not having accurate records.
Yeah, so it's important. And again, we appreciate your work on this and providing information in this space. Everything for birth certificates, medical records, the Department of Corrections, sports. This just goes right back to the created order. And I imagine, and it seems like most folks, I think we're in a moment right now where culture is kind of snapping back. And I have a friend who shared with me an apologetics concept that the created order is like a spring. I thought this was fascinating. And that the harder you pull on the created order, if you pull it beyond its rational limits, it snaps back faster. But I thought that was a powerful analogy.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that that's what we're experiencing right now. Just saw the judgment
lawsuits
coming out of New York, where there are actually going to be large payments made, and I think that's how some of this ends. But it's just so important.
Yeah, you saw
Zach,
like a snowball
please.
happen after that.
Yes.
Yeah, total snowball, where all these organizations, even the American Medical Association, are saying that, we shouldn't do these procedures on children anymore, and that there's not sufficient evidence, even though they claimed there was sufficient evidence before. So like it's just a snowball of these people like, we don't want a lawsuit on our hands, like we're gonna not do that anymore. So yeah, that has been happening so fast. So yeah,
and even to the point, if you're a parent and you don't affirm this idea, either vocally or through medical treatment, that you would in fact be abusing your child or neglecting your child, and be an unfit parent. Like that's how, and so there are times in history where you see things like Jim Crow, where fellow human beings are not being treated as fellow human beings, or these ideas that just get into a culture. And I've studied those historically. Now we're kind of living through one, and to hopefully seeing that unravel, and your work is a big part of that. Well, Zach, I've kind of asked you a battery of questions. I wanted to maybe pass it back to you to see if there's anything else that has been on your mind you think would be helpful to listeners just generally.
I think just talking with you and I, it's really fascinating to see how this work on the biology space can be put into churches and be brought to pastors and youth pastors. Because I really agreed with what you were telling me about how it's really important for kids and in the youth groups and things like that to have this scientific knowledge to really back up to what the Bible is saying. And so that's something that I think we could definitely collaborate on. It'd be very, very helpful, because I think that most churches, I feel like they're not really in that space on the science side in terms of just talking about it and helping really bolster what the Bible says too, and just arm people that way. I think arming people in both directions is great, like natural science, and also in the theological world as well. So both those put together, it's just like it's a powerhouse for the church. So yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. This is scientifically researched. It is absolutely cutting edge. You are right on the edge of these things in the cultural arguments, and so did want to recommend that to parents as well as pastors out there. Zach, this has been fascinating. Appreciate all your work. We'll link to Paradox Institute in the show notes. But kind of closing question, if you had a billboard on which to put a message to the broader church, what would you put on it?
So I thought about this, and I'd say truth and compassion are basically this two sides of the same coin, because you have to balance both of those. They're not actually at odds at all. They're the same type of thing put together, because that's something that our work has always tried to balance, is that you have to tell the truth, and when you tell the truth, you are being compassionate, and being compassionate is part of being truthful. And so those two things, we're never mean to people. We're always very clear about what the science says, but we don't lie to people. We don't back down from what the truth is. We're not afraid to, call people as they are and just be like, hey, this person is a male, this person is a female. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's important to recognize that. And So balancing those two things, just it's very important, because the culture likes to go either direction in terms of saying, like, you have to be completely kind, and compassion just means kindness and never upsetting anybody, and that's what compassion is. But sometimes people will be upset by the truth. I mean, in fact, oftentimes will be upset by the truth. And
You
so,
may
yeah,
experience a little bit of that from time to
yeah,
time.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's those two things go hand in hand. Being compassionate is actually being truthful. Being truthful is being compassionate. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm grateful. And it's fascinating, again, to be living in a moment where we're actually seeing this come to place, come to pass, with some of the detransitioners looking at people saying, why did you, I needed guidance, not a surgery. And if we're not the one to stand up and say, here's what is true, we know this, we're truly not being compassionate. So, Zach, again, I appreciate your work. Looking forward to continuing to stay in contact with you. We will link to Paradox Institute in the show notes, and look forward to seeing how God's going to continue to use you in the future in this topic.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you, Josh.